Hey Boost students, it's Miss Hall here. For today's video, we're going to be talking about figurative language. Now, figurative language means using parts of speech, using figures of speech. Figurative means not literal or not actual. So when you use figurative language, you're using words that don't actually mean what you say. For example, if I were to say, it's raining cats and dogs, I don't actually literally mean that outside cats and dogs are falling from the sky, right? It's a figure of speech. All right, the first type of figurative language we're going to talk about is hyperbole. And hyperbole is a figure of speech that uses deliberate exaggeration for emphasis. So if you look at these pictures here, the one on the left is the phrase, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. I'm not literally going to eat a whole horse. That would probably make me sick. Not to mention, it's gross and sad. So it's a figure of speech. What I mean is that I am really, really hungry. The second one is that this weighs a ton. Well, a ton is actually 2,000 pounds, and it would be very, very heavy if it weighed a ton. Again, it's a figure of speech that's exaggerating how heavy it is using hyperbole. The next type of figure of speech that's pretty common in poetry is a metaphor. And a metaphor is comparing two things that are not the same by saying that one thing is the other. At the dance, she was a duck out of water. She wasn't literally quacking and looking for a bottle of water, right? That would not make any sense. What I mean by saying she's a duck out of water means she's uncomfortable. She's not in her element. I'm comparing her at the dance to a duck out of water to make a comparison to make my poem or my story more interesting. So a metaphor is when you compare two things by saying that one thing is the other. And those are pretty common in a lot of poetry. Sometimes a poem is an extended metaphor, meaning the entire poem is comparing one thing to another. And we'll look at some examples of that in Bronx Masquerade. All right, up next we're going to talk about similes. And similes are very similar to metaphors. They're, again, comparing two unlike things. But in a simile, the poet uses the word like or as. And I picked these two because they're very cute and have little puppies on them. And the first one is, my dog is as smelly as dirty socks. Comparing the dog to dirty socks. It really helps you get a picture of what the dog is, how smelly the dog is. I am as sick as a dog. That means I feel terrible. I feel horrible. It doesn't mean that you're literally a dog or that your dog is literally socks, okay? Figures of speech, again, are using words in a way that goes against their literal meaning to add interest, to add depth, to make poems easier to understand and to really picture. The next type of figurative language that we're going to look at is personification. Personification is giving non-human or abstract things like animals or tables or trees, human characteristics. So if you look at the frog over here playing the banjo, right? This is obviously frogs cannot really play the banjo. But I might say, on a summer evening, the frogs at the pond played the banjo as I drifted off to sleep. The frogs aren't literally out there playing the banjo. What I mean is that the frogs are croaking in a way that sounds like a banjo being plucked, right? And that sound is what I'm hearing as I'm drifting off to sleep. Anytime that you give anything that's not human, it could be a tree. As I walked through the woods, the tree waved at me. The tree's not actually waving unless you're in The Wizard of Oz. The tree's leaves are moving because of the wind, right? That's what's literally happening. But I'm using personification. I'm using that figure of speech to give that non-human thing human traits, and that's what we call personification. Again, like metaphor, sometimes entire poems are personification. They're a tree or a frog that the whole poem is being treated as if it were human. All right, the last poetic device we're going to talk about today is imagery, and it's not exactly figurative language. Sometimes it is more literal, but I group it with figurative language because a lot of times figurative language is used to create imagery. So imagery is the use of sensory words to create sights, smells, tastes, and feelings in the reader's mind. So these are things that appeal to your five senses. So if you think back to my example in the simile of my dog is as smelly as dirty socks. In that example, I'm using a simile to create imagery. I'm using that comparison to help you smell what my dog smelled like. Or in my example of as I walked through the woods, the trees waved at me, that personification. I'm helping you visualize and see what the trees were doing. Or the frog played the banjo. I'm helping you hear what it is that the frog sounded like. So often these figures of speech are used to create imagery, to engage your senses more fully in the poem. Well, that's it for today. Go ahead and flip over your worksheet on the back. You will see some practice with using this figurative language, and we will look at some of this in Bronx Masquerade.